Okay, we are now recording. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to the EPC meeting. We've had roll call. We have a quorum. We're going to proceed. On to oral communications. Is there anyone who wishes to speak about anything that is not on the agenda? I see none. Okay, thank you all for participating today. A couple of quick announcements. We have our annual Communications and Safety Day coming up on June 25th. The actual event will run from 10 to 2, but those of us setting up the radio equipment will be starting as early as 8:30 out there with the communications trailer. You'll start to see some social media advertising about the event coming up shortly. And also there will be emails going out from me and maybe Ray about setup and time for the event. And I would ask that if all of the EPC members could show up during that day from any time from 10 to 2 would be great. Now, approval of the minutes. Minutes were attached. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I have a correction.
Okay.
This is Lynn on number 7.
Yes.
The last bullet point. It was May 7th.
Okay.
And it wasn't demo a fire adapted neighborhood. It was we used a NAFTA grant money to clear our roofs and gutters of leaves.
Okay. That correction. Bud, did you have a question?
No, I was moving to accept.
With that, I assume with that correction.
Yes.
Second.
Second, it's Chris.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Approved with that correction. Thank you all very much. Next item is creation of an ad hoc subcommittee to review the safety elements. This would be a very short term. That's why it's an ad hoc subcommittee, just until we get through this safety element. We've had a lot of, well, not a lot, but we've had 4 significant public comments plus the special meeting, and we will probably have at least one more special meeting plus the final safety element for review, and be good to have some committee members take a look at all those documents, coalesce it, and at least summarize it in a memo to this committee, which this committee can always reject, but at least a summary of important things to pay attention to. Anybody wishing to be on that committee? Rob? Anybody else? I'll be on the committee with Rob. Any other volunteers? I can't see all the hands because we've got a lot of people today. Okay, well, please, if you're interested in also getting on this subcommittee with Rob, just send him an email or send me an email and we'll go on. Next, very quickly, volunteer opportunities. We have 3. Would anybody like to be the secretary for the EPC? I've been taking the minutes for the past 1.5 years. Now that we have a fully staffed EPC, it would be nice to have someone take the minutes other than me and also get involved with leadership on the committee. Do I have any volunteers? Oh, I don't. If your hand is up, please speak up. Okay, I don't have any volunteers. We'll bring this up again at our next meeting. Do I have any volunteers for the EPC liaison to WPV Ready? We have a number of committee members working with WPV CERT and a couple of members who are on the board of CERT. I've been trying to attend all the meetings of WPV Ready, but I missed some. Is there anyone who would like to be the liaison to WPV Ready?
I would like to do that. That's
Great.
Lynn.
Great. Thank you, Lynn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Somebody is speaking. Please mute. Addie Hutchinson, I think you're speaking. Thank you. Now, the next volunteer is an EPC representative to the Wildfire Committee. There's an open spot on the Wildfire Committee for a representative from the EPC. Do I have any volunteers for that spot? Bud? Okay, unless anybody else wants to volunteer, we'll have Bud be our representative to the Wildfire Committee. Okay, with that, I am going to now turn it over to Bob Grandy of Fair and Piers, who has been working on an evacuation study, evacuation traffic study for several months. I want to thank Rob Young as chair of the evacuation subcommittee for doing an awful lot of footwork to help Bob out. But we're going to go ahead and give Bob the floor. And I think a lot of you are here for this presentation. So Bob, take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate that introduction. Jeremy, did you want to say a few words before I launch? Is there something you wanted to?
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for the opportunity. Just a thank you kind of across the board to Bob and Jason Pack and Dave Parisi from Fair and Piers and the subcontractors who've been working very hard on this project for close to a year now. I want to thank a working group that Bob put together that included representatives of the town, the Sheriff's Office, Department of Emergency Management, and Woodside Fire Protection District, who have been, they've met, I think 3 or 4 times at this point to go over progress. And a thank you to Dale and Rob for their participation as well. Bob, I've really enjoyed our meetings and the conversations that we've had starting in September, and really proud of the product that you guys have put together. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks. We'll go ahead and launch. I'm sharing screen now, so let me know if you can't see it. So this is the agenda for today. The first few items on the agenda are a kind of a repeat summary of the presentation we gave a few months ago to the committee. And then items 3 through 6 are all new items. So I'm going to try to go through the first dozen slides, which is just a review of where we've been, and spend most of our time on the latter 4 items of the presentation. So these are our work tasks. We've completed tasks 1 and 2 for the study. We'll be presenting today on tasks 3 and 4, which is around the evacuation scenario analysis and some strategies that we have developed for the town's consideration. And the next step after today's meeting will be to put together the formal report for the study that will come back to the committee and then go to the council for their consideration. But I would say that what we're presenting today will be the bulk of the analysis and the recommendations. We appreciate hearing your feedback on both of those so that we can incorporate that in the report. This is a identification of the major evacuation routes. These are kind of the major areas where we've looked at capacity issues. Certainly we consider all the feeders and how all the other streets in town are feeding into these routes, but this is where we've sort of focused our analysis in terms of looking at the capacity of the primary routes in the network. At our last meeting, we talked about analyzing 3 different scenarios, one in which all of the routes in red were open, and then that would be the first scenario, and the second and third scenarios involve a closure. The scenario 2, it assumes that Alpine and Arastadero are closed. It's what we're calling the North Routes scenario, where Sand Hill and Portola would be the evacuation routes. And scenario 3 is the opposite, where the North Routes, there's a closure because of the fire of the North Routes, and the South Routes are the evacuation routes that are assumed. So we look at those 3 scenarios in the evacuation analysis. This is a summary of what I call the key underlying parameters for the work. It's what we call a kind of a maximum evacuation stress test, and I'll go through these in a little bit of detail because I think it's important to understand. As I mentioned, we analyzed the major evacuation routes. The analysis is based on an evacuation order at 6 a.m. So a fire starting in the late evening, early morning hours, which has been pretty typical of many of the fires and the evacuations that we've seen. It's a full evacuation, so 100% of the town and immediate surrounding residents, no shelter in place assumed. All homes are assumed to be occupied. And besides the residential, which really makes up the bulk of the evacuation vehicles, we also looked at employee and equestrian trailers as part of that demand analysis. We've assumed a fairly aggressive beginning of the trip for residents, that 85% are assumed to begin their trip in the first hour. That sheriff and CHP traffic control would occur beginning about 30 minutes into the evacuation, after the evacuation order at those intersections. And that traffic control officers would prohibit inbound trips other than emergency vehicles. In other words, somebody trying to come into the community would not be allowed at sort of the gateway points unless they were part of the emergency response team. And we did not assume contraflow, so we only assumed a single outbound lane on the route. So those are kind of key elements that I think are important to understand of the analysis that we prepared. Also, we provide some ranges in evacuation times, and the ranges really fall into sort of two categories. One is around network capacity. So the first number that you will see in terms of the time at which the evacuation is complete is based on what we call baseline road capacities, consistent with the Highway Capacity Manual and what other recent evacuation studies have assumed. We also look at what happens if that capacity is reduced by 40% because of smoke, embers, any kind of items that don't involve a full closure. It could be a partial incident that happens, but sort of a reduced capacity scenario. And we also look at two evacuation levels. One where 90% will give a time when we estimate 90% of the population is evacuated, and the second when 100% is evacuated. And what we mean by evacuation is essentially when they reach I-280, when the trips have reached I-280.
From an ITF asset allocation that had no inflation protection to one that where we added 10% to the real return portfolio.
The next few slides are around the demand parameters, how we come up with the total number of vehicle trips that would be evacuating. And these are broken up into sort of these 5 categories. We'll touch base on each of those. Household trips make up the bulk, or vehicle trips from households make up the bulk of the trips. So this identifies the population, and that population, based on the number of households, is estimated to generate about a little over 3,100 evacuation trips from the Portola Valley alone. There's another 1,600 from the surrounding county zones. For Portola Valley, that ends up resulting in about 1.91 vehicles per household, vehicle trips per household. Comparing those to other studies that have been done, the Ashland study, which many are aware of, assume 1.4. But recent surveys from the Santa Rosa fire and the UC Berkeley study of the 2017 through 19 fires indicate higher numbers in the 1.75 to 1.9 range. So we're at in terms of vehicle trips per household, we're at the top end of the range of studies that we've looked at so far. And this 1.91 was based on data specific to Portola Valley in terms of persons per household and vehicles per household data that we were able to analyze. We also looked at trips in the Sequoias, and for the 6 a.m., there are 140 total employees in 3 different shifts and 308 residents. There is a shift change in that 6 a.m. time period where you've got the sort of late evening hour employees leaving and the daytime employees arriving. We assume that all of those 2 shifts would be on site and would be part of the evacuation. So that's 108 and 140 employees. I would also note that the 308 Sequoia residents is included in that population data that we showed on the prior slide. So how did that factor into employee trips? The San Mateo model estimates about a little over 1,400 employees over the course of a day in Portola Valley and the surrounding area. Ashland assumed that about 10% of their citywide population would evacuate on an overnight evacuation. We bumped that up to 20%. And on top of that, added the 108 employees from Sequoia. So that's yielding about 360 vehicle trips for the evacuation, about a quarter of all daily employees. And then finally, on the demand side, the last kind of piece of the triangle was the equestrian trailer trips. I want to thank you to Rob for his help on pulling a lot of this material together. We were able to identify both the estimated number of horses at the stables and trailers, as well as home-based horses, and came up with an estimate that in those sort of first 3 hours that we estimate that there could be around 100 trailers that could be evacuating. So this is information we were able to compile and incorporate into the analysis. Those 100 trailers, they're equivalent, get about a 3.0 equivalency in terms of a vehicle. So it's the equivalent of about 300 regular vehicle trips when they're assigned to the network. So that's how that's incorporated. Lastly, this evacuation demand curve, it's a revised version of the Ashland study analysis that was done. It's something that we presented, I think, on our last meeting, but these curves show when a trip starts. Over the course of, on the x-axis here, you're looking at from 0 to 4 hours. These are in minutes, so 60, 120, 180, and 240. On the y-axis, the percent of the population beginning their evacuation trip. And the blue line is the line that for employees that we used. So this essentially, and the green line was Ashland's line for residents during an overnight evacuation. We used something that assumed a quicker evacuation, this yellow line for residents. And then the red line is the line that we used for trailers, equestrian trailers. And just a bit of a background, for the employees, this curve shows that they're starting their trip much earlier, because employees don't, once they get the evacuation order, don't have to pack, and they essentially just leave town. So they're the first to leave town, so a fairly quick, you see about 100% are assumed to evacuate, start their trip within an hour. The yellow line is for, as I mentioned, for residents. This is a fairly, as I mentioned, aggressive assumption that about 85% begin their trip within the first hour. That's just the start of the trip from home. So that's the kind of a major input into the evacuation analysis, is when the trip starts. So now we're going to walk through some of the evacuation time results by scenario. So this is the first evacuation scenario with all routes open. This first slide, and I'll spend a few minutes talking through. First of all, we break it down by population group. So you'll see we broke down residents, employees, and trailers. We thought most would be interested in the first row, which is a resident evacuation. So I'll focus my attention on that. But if you have any questions about the other rows, happy to go into detail. What this shows is that 90% of the residents, and this is both Portola Valley and surrounding unincorporated communities of Ladera, Upper Los Trancos, Ola Honda, those communities, would be 90% would be evacuated by 7:15 to 7:30, with 7:15 being sort of the what I would call the baseline road capacity, and 7:30 being the reduced capacity, and 100% by 9 to 9:15. One of the reasons we give both the 90 and the 100% is that the 100% value is somewhat influenced by when the trip starts, and there are a small percentage of trips that don't start until as much as 2 hours to 3 hours after the evacuation order. So this kind of gives you a sense of when most residents are evacuated and when all are evacuated. Employees obviously happen quicker, and the equestrian trailers happen later, largely because it takes a couple of factors in the equestrian trailers. One, it takes longer to load the horses, and in some cases, trailers have to come in from outside the community, so that transport into the community takes some time, and so that's why these numbers tend to be later. In addition to these evacuation times, and this is the end of the evacuation, again, just as a reminder, this is when folks either 90% or 100% reach 280. We also provided some data on the average evacuation time, depending upon when you start your trip. So if your trip starts in one of these windows, this is the average time, and we have two data points. One is the baseline road capacity and one is the reduced road capacity. So you can see, and I would note that these are averages. So if you are closer to 280, you're going to be below the average. If you're farther away, you could be significantly above the average as you work through there. But in a sort of baseline road capacity without any impedances, you can see those trips range from about 10 to 20 minutes on average for the whole area. When you have a reduced capacity, that goes up significantly, particularly in the peak hour between about 6:30 and 7:30 or 8 o'clock. In that window, those trips can more than double in time. And we provided a histogram, which maybe makes it a little easier to see the sort of the differences. This is that same data, but plotted with the blue showing the baseline capacity and the orange showing the reduced capacity. So you can see the time differential is kind of greatest for those who are starting their trip an hour to an hour and a half, if you will, after the evacuation order. And then as you get further into the window, those later trips, there's less time differential just because most of the vehicles have evacuated and there's less congestion. So the next scenario is what we call the north routes only. Essentially, most of the trips are assigned to Sand Hill, a small number through the Woodside community, but most to Sand Hill Road. You'll see that when taking a look at the evacuation times, the end time for residents, it's significantly later if you only have one route available, significantly longer evacuation times required if Alpine were to be closed and not available for evacuation. I'll just pause here for a minute. I would say this is the worst of the three scenarios, with the north routes open in terms of the longest evacuation times. And this shows if the north routes was the only option for evacuating, you can see significantly longer evacuation times, both under the baseline and a reduced capacity scenario. So times upwards of 45 minutes to an hour under baseline and up to an hour and a half under a reduced capacity scenario. So if you have a combination of only one route available and reduced capacities, that evacuation time could get up to an hour and a half on average. And this is the histogram that matches that data. Last scenario 3, which is what if the north routes are closed, but Alpine and Arastadero are the only options for evacuation. You'll see that these numbers fall somewhere in between scenarios 1 and 3 in terms of the evacuation times. Sorry. So these are the scenario 3 values in terms of averages. You can see they're less than scenario 2, but substantially greater than the all routes open option.
Oh, you remembered. Oh, it's beautiful. Wow. Yeah.
And this is the histogram that shows the difference between sort of the base and the reduced capacity scenario. So the next few slides are some strategies. We provide recommendations or suggestions for consideration in really 3 different areas. One is on the supply side. So what can you do to the road network to both in terms of capacity and management of the network to help reduce evacuation times? Second, what can you do on the demand side to reduce the demand for trips that are loading onto the network. And then third, we talk about some communication strategies that are sort of important elements of getting information out both before and during the course of evacuation. So I do have a map that follows. I'll touch very briefly on these items in red, and then I have a map that illustrates what those are. So I think that the key thing is break this out into really two kind of topical areas. As I mentioned, one is how to manage the evacuation in terms of those being really focused on the first three areas. And then the last two are about potentially adding some capacity that would help reduce the evacuation times. And I'll talk about that, kind of those in just a minute as I walk through the following slides. So this slide is really more focused on the evacuation traffic management. One of the areas of analysis for the safety element looked at roads that only had one access point or egress point and that were in identified high wildfire areas. And so this area kind of defined as the Highlands, which is the Santa Maria Wayside and Hayfields Road access to Portola, was identified as an area of a constrained parcels area. And so one of the strategies that we've talked about or suggested is that there be a targeted evacuation management for these parcels in particular because of the combination of the single egress point and being in a high wildfire hazard area. This kind of strategy could certainly be applied, and we'll talk more about that in a bit, to other communities that are or areas that are more remote. But this is looking into maybe giving more, if you will, advance notice of evacuations if there was a fire, maybe say a little bit further distant from the area, but appeared to be moving in that direction. And once the initial zones around that fire were identified, the notion here is that areas, these sort of residential areas would receive a notice, an early evacuation warning, if you will, and also kind of special, potentially special traffic management by sheriff in terms of those access points. The next thing I'll mention is that the little yellow kind of crosses are locations where Department of Emergency Management and sheriffs and fire have identified as potential traffic control locations where sheriffs, or in the case of 280 CHP, would be located if there were a full town evacuation to manage traffic at those intersections. We've identified 4 potential additional areas that are shown in green. One is at Portola and Santa Maria. They're at the constrained parcels area, sort of managing egress from those properties onto Portola. The second pair is on West Ridge at the 2 intersections with Cervantes, which is a major feeder into West Ridge. So it would provide some additional traffic control there. And the last is at Alpine at the access for Webb Ranch, which is the stop control intersection. And we identified that because it's the largest of the stables and for an evacuation would require sort of a left out to get to 280 and egress. So those are the kinds of evacuation management strategies that we've identified for consideration. Oop. My apologies, moved a bit too fast.
Or if they unmute me. Does that make sense?
Okay, here we go. So I'm next going to talk about Alpine Road, and particularly the segment between West Ridge and I-280.
I should have
What we suggested is is the consideration of widening the outbound shoulder lane to provide kind of a dual use facility that would be an evacuation lane, a second exiting evacuation lane during the evacuation, But during all other times, it'd be just a wider buffered bike lane. So this is a strategy that's used in southern states during hurricanes, where they provide a wider shoulder lane and it's designated as an evacuation lane. So this would require some widening on both sides of Alpine. You currently have a section in through Ladera where there are 3 lanes. So you have a center left turn lane and a through lane in each direction. And the idea here would be to widen that outbound shoulder between West Ridge and Ladera on the and also on the other side of Ladera between Ladera and 280. So you could essentially have this sort of, by widening a shoulder in those 2 segments, have a continuous second outbound lane, making use of that center left turn lane through Ladera. So these are a couple of cross sections of how that would look like in the segment between West Ridge and Ladera. These are some cross sections of what it would look like between Ladera and I-280, essentially the same concept of this sort of creating an outbound evacuation lane on the shoulder. And these are some plan views of that shows there would be some potentially some widening on both sides, but there's an opportunity to in terms of available right of way from, this shows West Ridge heading towards Ladera. And then we've also had an engineer take up the segment, look at the segment between La Cuesta Drive and 280. What this would do is get us a second outbound lane that would match up with the 2 lanes once you get to I-280 and the interchange. We have had some questions about roundabouts, and we just wanted to potential for roundabouts at La Mesa and La Cuesta, and just wanted to provide some feedback from an evacuation standpoint. There are some challenges with if a roundabout were to be implemented, and just wanted to mention those. Number one, roundabouts are designed for an 18-mile-an-hour speed, and in particular, they accomplish that by having a raised center island that prohibits somebody from driving straight through the intersection. So you're forced to make a slow down approach on the entry and travel through the roundabout at 18 miles an hour. So by definition, these are slow vehicle designs, and would essentially set that as your maximum speed through the corridor, you know, in terms of your ability to evacuate, unless you wanted to drive over the raised median island. And in fact, some of the islands are made to be mountable, others portions of it, and others have a centered area which is not mountable. It's some kind of art feature or even further raised element. So the ability to go through is all at relatively low speed, and you can't increase that. You also have an issue with accommodating large trailers and fire trucks. So this shows what a large trailer / fire truck would do going around or trying to make that movement. It also locks in a single outbound lane, because if you this dash line around the outer perimeter would be the outer edge of the roundabout that would be able to accommodate a large truck, fire truck, or horse trailer. And so if you were to build something like this, you would not be able to have a second outbound lane, as we've suggested on the previous slides. So those are some of the considerations with respect to roundabouts and evacuation challenges. Last 2 slides now, so we're about to wrap up. Our last few slides on the demand side. One of the comments that was made on our by I think a member of the committee at our last call was, what about a 1 car per household evacuation pledge? And this is something that a lot of communities are actually considering. One of the challenges is that some families need to have a second car, and so we talk about an alternative of if there were enough advance warning, that you could potentially do an early offsite placement of a second car in advance to try and ameliorate that need. But you can see, if you go from 1 car per household, as that is indeed the demand, that's a significant reduction from the 1.9 that we've assumed would be occurring. The second element is to identify some local shelter locations and plan and implement those facilities, particularly those for those who may have some challenge. And we know that, for instance, the Sequoias is working on those types of, already has some buildings that are sort of designed to accommodate shelter in place if that's needed. But this is basically a sort of a plan if there were if you were unable to evacuate for whatever reason, is that this is sort of an alternate plan for how to address and sheltering during a portion of a hazard event. And then lastly, information side strategies. These are very important strategies that communities are looking now at as part of addressing evacuations. Everything from wayfinding and signs and barriers to direct evacuation traffic, to investigating hardening of communication systems so that they don't fail during an evacuation. This is important not only for notification, but also if things change in terms of evacuation routes, to be able to communicate during an evacuation scenario. We talked about this third bullet, which is targeted communication and mandatory evacuation notice during all events. And we identified not only the constrained Highlands parcel area, but some potential areas, say in Upper Los Trancos and some of the more remote or elevated areas. And the idea here is to get advance notice whenever there's a nearby evacuation notice or warning. And then also looking at installing some vehicle monitoring devices and variable message signs. And this is to be able to manage an evacuation if something were to change, if a route were to become blocked in mid-evacuation, to be able to provide that, communicate that information, just another way of communications. And this is the last slide. This is in talking with Dale and Rob, thinking through kind of next steps for the committee, potential next steps. And I'll preface this by saying that there has been for several months now, a Department of Emergency Management working group with the town that have been working on evacuation strategies, particularly as it relates to the schools and the Sequoias. But the notion here is that working group would continue to work to develop more detailed evacuation plans and address this series of areas, over the course of the coming months and year or so. And I'll certainly be happy to let Dale and Rob, talk more about these, but some of these are items we've already talked about. Others are ones that came about as a result of concerns raised at, like, the daytime employee evacuation, something that was raised on our previous call. So with that, my last slide is that the next step, as I mentioned earlier, is to present the draft study for review. We'll take the materials we hear today and incorporate them in the report, and then bring that back for review. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. As usual, the way we will handle the questions is we will go to committee first to see if there are questions and concerns, and then we will questions and clarifications. Then we will go to public comment, and then we will bring it back to committee for any additional comments and direction maybe to Bob. So with that, I see several hands up. I see Marianne, your hand went up first. Go ahead, please. There you go.
Thanks, Bob. The one thing when I was looking at this that came to my mind, this is assuming like a Santa Rosa style fire. And what I learned from the CCU fire, where we had warning, that there is something like an evacuation warning, if there is time, before there is an evacuation, requirement. And for example, I would absolutely leave at the time when there is an evacuation warning issued. And I assume that you have not taken that into consideration with your scenario?
That is correct. So we wanted to do what I guess we'd call a maximum stress test. So what if there were not, a substantial advance warning? So certainly if there was an advance warning, and we certainly see that with fires where they're approaching from a greater distance to the community, that there are people who will evacuate early prior to the notice itself, even prior to an evacuation warning. And to the extent we would see that, it would reduce those overall evacuations times. But this, the intent here was to kind of do what we called a maximum stress test, which is what if there is no warning, and you literally have something probably closer to the Paradise Fire situation.
Yeah, and obviously it makes perfect sense. It's just, even I, who has been involved in evacuation, what have you, for decades, I actually didn't realize that there was a thing like an evacuation warning. And with the CCU fire, I know we were all on edge, and some of us had the cars parked and whatever. And that's just something to consider when we are looking at the different scenarios. Obviously, when it's a catastrophic fire like Santa Rosa, there will not be time for that. Thank you.
No, it's a really good point. And I think that being prepared to leave early, and in some cases leaving before that notice is given, certainly would reduce the overall effect in terms of evacuation times.
Okay, next, Craig, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to follow up a little bit. One thing it feels to me like when I hear this presentation is it really doesn't get at what Marianne was saying directly. And I think it's important for the residents to understand. I mean, you've kind of created a worst case scenario, which is a good thing for planning, but I also think that people need to understand what is likely to happen versus this kind of worst case. So I hope when you sort of put the final study together, maybe at the beginning, you do a little bit more to talk about the different kinds of evacuation, whether it's immediate or urgent. Because if it's really urgent and there's a raging fire, people aren't going to have time to bring horse trailers and stuff in. Everybody's going out, like that's it. Whereas if we've got a little bit more warning. So it just feels like there's other scenarios that I realize you don't have time to go through completely, but it'd be nice to, at least at the beginning, sort of set this in the broader context. So with that, the questions I have is, there are a couple of things like, on the northbound exit, why did you include Portola Road? I would have thought that would have slowed traffic down, given everybody smoothly moving out Sandhill. The idea of people making a left and sort of slowing down to make that hard left on Portola Road seems like that would make it slower, not faster. So I'll just ask the questions, and then Bob, feel free to sort of jump in and answer them. How do people merge? Like, we've got these evacuation routes and we have these small streets coming down. How do people end up merging unless there's traffic control? Because I saw those traffic control locations. Some of them seem like they were way, way, way up Alpine, which I didn't really understand. But it seems like at every intersection, people are trying to merge. Is there some methodology to thinking about how those merges happen? And then the last question was, is there any looking at the traffic cams to see if we could do vehicle monitoring, maybe in real time through the traffic cams that we already have up, the license plate readers? So Bob, I don't know if you could at least sort of address those in sort of brief.
Yeah, in brief, we didn't assign very many trips through Woodside on the north at routes only scenario, but we do believe that there would be some leakage and that there would be some trips that would travel up Portola and Whiskey Hill. And so there are a small number of trips, but we still have the overwhelming majority, a very high percentage of trips staying on Sandhill Road. But one thing I would say is that the presumption is that if you have a full town evacuation, that the CHP at 280 Sand Hill, and the only route available was Sand Hill, that they would not allow inbound vehicles, if you will, on Sand Hill. So there wouldn't be the normal conflict that you would have making a left turn on a Portola or Whiskey Hill. where you'd have opposing inbound traffic unless it's emergency vehicle traffic. So the notion here is that if there's a full town evacuation, you would not have that inbound conflicting traffic movement. So it'd be easier to make a left turn. On the flip side, while it might be easier to make a left turn, you've got a longer trip to travel through Woodside to get to Woodside and 280. So we were looking at something on the order of 80 to 90% of all trips staying on Sand Hill, but some filtering through Woodside. Other questions: how do people merge unless there's traffic control? Oh, why are the traffic control far up Alpine? The way that DEM has identified it is that it's basically zone based. So the issue is if you have a zone that's evacuated, they've identified potential traffic control locations in each zone. We put all of them on one map. That doesn't mean that all of them are going to happen at one time. It just means those are, when a zone is called up, it means the sheriff and fire will have access to Zone Haven, which will tell them these are potential traffic control locations where you would have the greatest need, because it's two streets connecting that have the greatest traffic loading to the network. So that's sort of what we did. And it doesn't mean that there would be sheriffs at all of those locations. It just means depending upon the situation and the evacuation scenario, those are the places they would initially look and say, hey, these are places where we might place people in. And that traffic control, and the farther away you get from 280, the less conflict you're likely to have, just because the volumes get lower. And so the normal traffic control would work, but especially for locations along Alpine from Portola to 280, those are pretty critical because you've got a lot of streets that require a left turn on Alpine. And so having traffic control at those locations, I think probably both the combination of the amount of left turns and the conflicting traffic on Alpine, those are pretty important locations. So they vary, and I think ultimately it's going to be the call of the incident commander that is assigned to the fire to make those kinds of decisions with the incident team on where exactly to place traffic control that works the best. And I think vehicle monitoring through traffic cams and license plate, that definitely is something that could be done. We need to make sure that all of that information is made available to the incident team as well. So that could be part of just making sure that all that communication is available so that they're able to monitor situations. I don't know if that answered all your questions, but
Pretty close. So I didn't quite get, like, how did the little side streets merge with this sort of main flow? And then the other one was just, when you guys do your final report, can you sort of conceptualize these particular assumptions in the larger context of, because most evacuations, CAL FIRE, if they have any say, it's going to be, they're going to give us 3 days warning. It's not going to be this sort of, oh, surprise, it's 6 a.m. So I think your assumptions make sense to me for worst case, but it needs to be conceptualized.
I think we can definitely add in the report itself. It's hard to do in the deck, but we can definitely add in the report kind of a broader discussion of the range of evacuation, scenarios and how the evacuation might differ for those.
Okay. And then the merging, how does that sort of work? Little side streets come down, and do we, I guess what I'm after is it important, say through WPV Ready or something, that we communicate to people, here's the social standard for allowing merging in an emergency? Or is it everybody fends for themselves and you just shove your car into the range? So I'm just curious how other places have dealt with that and how you thought about that in terms of the study.
It's a good question. I'm not sure that I've seen anybody adopt a policy or a recommendation around how to manage sort of other than follow the traffic control that's in place. That would be kind of the beginning point that I would make. So if you've got a stop sign, stop controlled intersection, to follow the traffic control process, but it's something we'll follow up and maybe talk with our sheriff representatives to see if they have any suggestions on exactly what kind of guidance to provide. Dale or Rob, I don't know if either of you have anything you want to add, but that would be, I can do a follow-up and see what kind of information we can get on that.
Yeah, I'm thinking particularly on the sort of western slope with the, the constrained parcels. There's a number of those both in Portola Valley and also in Woodside, which is directly north of us. And we just need to have some kind of model to think about how we're going to get those people out. And, maybe it's just, we have stop signs, temporary stop signs that get put up that cause breaks, but then that might change your analysis of what the traffic flow is. So that's kind of what I'd be interested to see.
Okay, we'll follow up on that. And
yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for taking my lengthy questions. Thank you, Dale. I'm done.
Okay, Bud?
Yes, I have a few questions. When you're talking about the things you could do to make it easier to get out, you haven't mentioned anything about cutting back the trees that overhang the roads. When we heard about the Paradise Fire, many trees just fell across roads, even not a major stop, but someone had to get out with a chainsaw and clear it before anyone could move on. So there's nothing in your write-up about cutting back the trees that overhang the roads. Also looking at the north route, first of all, the Alpine route, you've taken into account people in Ladura, in a sense, having to come onto the route and making congestion, but you've done nothing about thinking about the people from Woodside going north on Portola Road, making congestion, and that's going to be slowing that process, that route down considerably. So that should be included, I think. Then since I live at the Sequoias, I have a number of things about Sequoias that I think you have not taken into account. There's no traffic control at Willowbrook. We will have a lot of cars and buses and so forth, and ambulances taking people off of our campus. There should be some kind of control there to get onto Portola Road. It's not on your map as an added place. There'll be buses coming in to take people away from Sequoias. There's no, they're not emergency vehicles, they're big buses. And there's nothing in your plan to permit buses coming in to remove, and of course, ambulance and so forth. And at Sequoias, there is no plan to shelter in place. That's old. That was 10 years ago, before fires that have been raging in California that come so fast and so quickly, and we have nothing to do that we control. We are not planning to shelter in place, no matter what our administration in San Francisco may say. The residents here are not planning that particular scenario. So could you answer those questions?
We certainly, vegetation management is, a wildfire strategy. It's not sort of our specialty from a traffic standpoint. So so that's something we would kind of lean on others, and typically that's handled by the fire district in terms of making those kind of recommendations. So it's those are usually handled separate from the sort of evacuation capacity analysis. I have no problem in including that as a strategy here, but we really couldn't provide any advice on that in terms of like where that would happen and how that would happen, because our expertise is really on the transportation network itself. In terms of, let me just look through the notes. The question about people from Woodside going north on Portola, is that, you're talking north of the intersection of Portola and Sand Hill and that section?
No, if you look at the map, there are Woodside and Portola are interwoven.
Okay.
Right across from the town center is Woodside.
Yeah, so we have assumed
getting off the road too.
Yeah, in our analysis, we have assumed all of those people are part of the evacuation. So they are assumed to be evacuating along with the town of Portola. So we've assumed both town of Portola residents and then the surrounding residents on, say, Upper Los Trancos, the area on Old La Honda, Ladera, all of those surrounding areas are assumed to be evacuating along with Portola Valley residents. It's about another 1,600 vehicle trips. So all of those are included in the evacuation analysis. So that those travel times, those evacuation times, I should say, that we identified are for a combination of the local residents plus the surrounding residents, kind of all of those people to evacuate.
Yeah, but Woodside is not in our sphere of influence, and yet they're going to be getting on those same roads going north on Portola Road. You need to add that in, I think.
But we did it by zone. So anything that was in a zone that touched all those roads was included.
Okay.
And as far as the access for Sequoia, I know there's a lot of ongoing discussion with the DEM, Department of Emergency Management Working Group, around both the Sequoias and the schools, and ongoing work in terms of developing sort of more detailed evacuation plans and working with both the Sequoias and the schools. So I think that's a work in progress. I am not involved in that, but I think it's going to continue to occur, and I certainly part of that discussion I think will be traffic control for the Sequoias, and my impression is that would sort of be a priority in terms of managing the evacuation of the emergency services groups to support the Sequoias in that evacuation. So they would not prohibit buses from coming in to do an evacuation of the Sequoias or the schools in that case. I think when I was talking about traffic being prohibited, it was largely personal vehicles that were might be coming back into the evacuation area.
But you don't have a traffic control spot at Willowbrook and Portola.
That's a good point. We'll follow up on that.
Thank you.
But just a quick comment. That's because at this point, the sheriff's office and DEM have not identified that as yet as a traffic control point. And I'm sure after this conversation, we can suggest they do.
So there used to be a key in the set of keys, actually.
Gary Nielsen, please mute. Okay, I see a question from Marianne. One follow-up, Marianne?
Oh, hang on a second.
My follow-up is regarding horse trailers. To what level have you done research about the private horse trailers and traffic in which areas? Because I would assume that probably most of them would be going Westridge and then would be coming straight into Westridge. And depending how many there are, traffic would obviously be quite impeded. And the other question I have, as far as I know, the horse people in Portola Valley are very well organized. And have we talked to them what their plans are? Thank you.
Answer that one for Marianne.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Rob.
So Marianne, I reached out to all of the private horse people in Portola Valley to understand what their plans are, where the horse trailers were coming from. What we wanted to try to do in this bounding exercise so that we'd understand how much traffic we would have is we as accurately as possible tried to account for every horse and every horse trailer in Portola Valley. There is an organization that does emergency evacuation of horses that would be coming in later if necessary to actually bring horses out too. That's something that I did not get a feeling for how many would be necessary for that. But every horse and every horse trailer in the valley, I think we've got a good number on.
And just to add to that, Rob, we did talk to the San Mateo County Large Animal Evacuation Group, and that's the last row in the spreadsheet that we're showing now. They did indicate they could bring up 4 trailers, that it would be up to a 45-minute travel time to get in, and then 45 to 60 minutes to load a barn, and about 2 to 2.5 hours of total travel time. So we sort of factored that into our analysis based on what they told us. But And I think we also factored in that not all of the trailers that we show, particularly like for Webb Ranch, are there. Some of these are, I think, assumed to be brought in by owners of horses who would bring in a trailer, but they would be associated with the horses that are there.
Actually, that is not really my question. I understand that. The people I know here, they all have their own horse trailer and it's sitting on their property. So my nightmare scenario is just one single horse trailer jackknifed on Westridge. And that's why I'm saying I understand the long term, but people here, they have their horse trailers and I assume, and that's why I'm asking if we could do some research there, they will want to get out. And the question is, how are they going to get out? And how is this really going to impact in the first 60 minutes? That's my question. I am not a horse owner and I'm not an expert, but it worries me.
Well, first I would say to your last question, the evacuation times assume that all of these trailers are evacuating. So we've incorporated that into the analysis that assumes they are leaving, that we've got over 100 horse trailers departing in the 3-hour window. As to an incident on Westridge, if a horse trailer gets into an accident, that is, I guess the one thing I would say is one of the reasons for suggesting that in terms of that specific situation, a couple of officers may do traffic control on Westridge at Cervantes, is that you would have the ability to manage traffic. And in that kind of situation where you had an incident, you'd have somebody close by that could manage traffic to get around that kind of situation. Presumably that would not block both lanes of traffic, and you'd be able to do some kind of traffic management while that vehicle is removed.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions, clarifications from committee members?
I have a,
Jerry,
Hi, Jerry.
I have a couple quick ones. I think the report should specifically talk about what kind of inbound vehicles will be allowed, because the way you look at it, it is that no horse trailers, no buses, no anything can come in, but that's not true. So I think the public, when they read this, should understand that there are options for inbound traffic for specific vehicles for specific reasons. And the second point is, I think if we don't mention in the report some thought about the schools, even if it is we are not adding that in, that is being done separately, the report should have that kind of information, because many people will look quickly at that, not find it, and consider the report inadequate. So I strongly encourage that there be some statements around that.
Thank you, Jared. We're happy to provide the latest information on the ongoing discussions with the DEM working group around the schools and incorporate that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Anything else from the committee members before I go to public comment and questions?
Dale, this is Lynn Eisberg.
Hi, Lynn.
And I think also when you present the report, if you could make an assumption or state that you've assumed that as these small roads with one egress are merging into the exit routes, that you're assuming it's exiting traffic allows every other car, just, you know, like a common courtesy, that point be brought out, because you like where I live, there might be 30 cars that need to come out, but we can't get out because nobody's letting us in. So if you could address that in the report, that you know, the common courtesy of, I guess they call that the zipper effect, where you just are merging like that, where every other car, so at every road that's feeding onto an exit route, you'll be allowing a lot of cars in ahead of you. So just maybe make that point. And that also that report is assuming that Woodside is not evacuating at the same time, and make that very clear. And maybe you did, but those would just be two things I was thinking of. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see Vic's hand up. Go ahead, Vic.
Thank you. My question is with respect to traffic management, to what degree has any consideration been given in the report to the use of trained volunteers to help facilitate the problems of merging traffic and other issues that might arise in actually getting these roads adequately covered in the event of an emergency evacuation?
We have not talked about that, but again, that's something I can follow up with the emergency services representatives in our working group and ask for their feedback on that. But we've not talked about that yet.
All right, Bob, the reason I raise that is, and I'll leave it at that, is not to make more work for what you very capably presented here. But my concern is if there is a broad range fire over a large geographical area, is how well we're going to really be able to have traffic management with the limited personnel we have, and whether we ought to be looking to training some volunteers. There's a great deal of skepticism about whether that can be done. But I think in the event of an intense emergency, this could be really important, and also to recognize that volunteers are going to appear and start doing this if there isn't adequate coverage. So I would ask you to give some thought to that process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vic. That's a good and interesting point. Okay, any other committee members speak up, or we're going to move to public comment? Okay, thank you. The first hand I see is Julie Forquette. Julie, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
My concern centers around the assumption that this is the worst case scenario when schools haven't been considered. I live on Hillbrook, and it can take us 2 minutes to just turn left on to Alpine Road during a regular school rush, much less something happening during an evacuation. And I think about parents working in Silicon Valley who, let's say there's a dry lightning strike at noon in Windy Hill. They get a notice on their phone via text that everybody's being evacuated. They're going to drive home. It's going to take them a while, depending on where they work, to get back to Portola Valley. They're going to be desperate. I mean, desperate to get in, and having a sheriff tell them they can't go in and pick up their kid is going to cause chaos. Once they get in one way or the other, they're going to be traveling the opposite direction of the primary evacuation. They're going to go to grab their kids, maybe go back to their homes, depending on what the threat looks like. They may have another kid they've got to pick up at home, and then go out. So they're going to be a lot more miles driven than what it will take to get everybody out going in one direction at 6 a.m. So I think it would be a really good idea not to call this current scenario the worst case scenario.
Okay. Thank you, Julie. My comment on that is we had lengthy discussions with the working group and so on in picking the time. And part of the issue that we had, and certainly Fair and Pierce has, is there are really no good studies out there, nothing to base the information on to figure out how you model the school evacuation. Now, the DEM, the working group sponsored by the DEM, is working with the schools, all the schools and the Sequoias, to evaluate their evacuation plans. And the next phase of this, we get there, is to look at how that works into and with this study. So this study is kind of a baseline, and I agree with you. Is this the worst case? Probably not, but at least it bounds the problem that we have on determining what is the capacity of our roadways for evacuation. Thank you, Julie. Bob, do you have any comments other than that?
No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Okay, the next hand I see is Karen. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, I want to take this up to a kind of a bigger level. So in the wildfire committee, when I was on it, I had thought of that the key thing to widen would be the Ladera to 280 section, which is about 100 feet, 75 feet, convert that. So it's 2 lanes out completely with the middle lane. So how much would that impact these numbers? And then, that seems like a feasible thing to do, a hassle because that's county land, but so how much would that small piece impact the numbers? And then adding into that, assuming we did that or the county did that, how much would that impact if we did Westridge to Ladera? Because I think that would be nice for the town, even if we didn't have an evacuation, because dealing with the bicyclists on Alpine is, not the most pleasant thing all the time. So having that buffer would be lovely. So I'd like to see numbers on that. And then kind of the third related comment on this would be more for the town is if we widen that section, what about utilities? Because the right of way is just not, there's things underneath there. And how should that cost? And are there sewer lines there? Are there other things, electrical, other infrastructure we have to deal with? I think that's kind of my questions. Thank you.
We don't have costs for the widening that we've developed. We have had engineers go out and take a look though, and do field reviews, and the direction that we have is that it is feasible to do the widening. I don't think we're talking about a significant cost because I don't believe we're talking about a significant relocation of utilities. Certainly not. I mean, one of the things they did look at was utility poles and any kind of vertical issues like that might cause a significant cost in terms of having a relocation. They didn't identify any significant kind of anticipated utility costs, and we're looking at probably doing some widening. It's going to vary a little bit segment by segment, but doing a little bit of widening on both sides of the street, which means you're not really taking means you're maybe shifting the lanes a little bit, if you will, in the end, but doing an overlay that is sort of a modest, maybe additional 5 to 10 feet at most on each side. There is a section where the path comes right up against the street where there might be a little additional cost in terms of relocating the path or modifying the path, maybe putting in a small retaining wall in order to make that work. But the group felt like there were no major feasibility issues, and this would not be any kind of extraordinary cost to implement. In terms of what would the effect be of adding a second lane, we haven't studied that, but we know that you're essentially not quite doubling the capacity. So we expect that it would, and in particular, we see the highest volumes on that segment between Westridge and 280 on Alpine under each of the evacuation scenario, well, with the exception of the one where it's closed. But we see the highest volume in that segment, so we think it would have the highest benefit in terms of reducing travel. And while I don't think it would cut travel in half, I do think it has the potential to make upwards of a 50% reduction. That would just be my estimate, but that we haven't actually run the numbers.
What about the part between Ladera and 280? That short section.
I think that my sense is that's the easier segment to address than the segment from Westridge to Ladera. But I think there's benefit to doing both. If we could bring that, essentially that evacuation lane all the way back to Westridge, that evacuation shoulder lane, I think it would have significant benefits, because then you would be able to, that's where we really see the sort of the confluence of trips coming from West Ridge with trips coming from Alpine from further west. And so it's from that point onward to 280, that's where we have the highest volume. So I think we would recommend pursuing both segments. So you get a continuous second outbound lane all the way from West Ridge to 280.
That sounds wonderful, and sounds wonderful that it is not going to be any exorbitant cost. So I would, I guess my comment, not a question, would be for the committee to recommend that to the town council to move, somehow. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Next, I see Rita Comas.
Hi, thank you for taking my questions. Just want to mention the scenic corridor that we have, which would be affected by the widening. I know, yes, I'm very concerned about the evacuation, but I would be remiss if I don't mention the scenic corridor. And then by widening the road, there's a bunch of easements there. And so I don't know if you looked into the easements to see if it's even feasible that road, those roads could be widened. You may want to check, or you may have already checked. And as far as the reversed evacuation, with all the construction that's going on right now on Arrastradero, on Alpine Road going towards Menlo Park, it takes a long time to get back home into Portola Valley right now. And I just can't imagine if somebody has, there are a lot of people, there are lots of little kids now in Portola Valley, but there are a lot of people that are over the age 70, and perhaps both household members don't drive. And if someone has to come back into Portola Valley to then help their partner or whomever evacuate, we have to plan for that, because that will happen. They will come back in to get a family member or pets or their horses, which I see as more than just pets in this beloved community. And my last thing is all the construction that is right now proposed and looks like a reality in Portola Valley, all along that route, over 100 units being built, starting at Ford Field, all the way through to the end of, at the beginning of Portola Road. I don't know if all of that construction setup is factored in for a plan B and a plan C, and how we would then move safely through all of this construction. Whereas when we had so much construction on West Ridge between Alamos and Alpine, it took an extra 12 minutes every day just to go that one block, every single day, going one way or coming up the other way. So I'd like to know if there is a plan B and plan C with all the construction proposed, and what we can do for that, reverse evacuation for people getting their loved ones and the easements. Thank you.
With respect to Alpine and widening Alpine, there's already an existing shoulder in that outbound direction that varies from, I think, roughly, maybe in some cases as little as 4 feet to as much as 6 or 8 feet. So but the shoulder is not really intended to drive on. So a big issue is not necessarily just the widening to get that 4 to 6 feet, in some cases 8 feet up to 11, but it's also to provide the structural section so you can drive on it. So we don't feel like it's going to affect the scenic corridor, because we're talking about even in the most constrained section where there's only a 4-foot shoulder, we're just adding 7 feet of pavement. And in some areas that might mean widening on both sides. In other areas that might mean you only have to widen on the outbound directional side, and that we would determine, and the issue of easements would be addressed with sort of more detailed design. But we feel like that amount of widening is feasible, and I'm not sure I know how to address the question about construction. Is that construction of homes? That is the question.
I think, Bob, that's
Yes.
new construction over the new housing element, and no, that certainly was not considered in this traffic study. Anything else, Rita?
Yes, just the whole thing of the reverse evacuation, people coming back into town to get their loved ones or pets, or their important papers. People will do that, whether we want it or not.
Yeah, I don't know that we're going to get a commitment from the emergency management providers on exactly. I mean, because I think every evacuation scenario is unique, but what we're looking at is a townwide evacuation scenario. In other words, an order that everybody must evacuate in town. And I think in that kind of a scenario, what we have heard is it's up to the incident commander, and depending on who that is, but that it's most likely a scenario that if you had that level of evacuation, you simply would be very unlikely you would be able to allow anybody who wanted to come back into the community to re-enter while the actual evacuation is going on, just because you would be putting emergency management personnel in place to fight the fire, to manage traffic, and you'd have such a large demand for an outbound evacuation. So we can follow up and see what, I just don't know that we're going to get a single answer, because that is going to be something that ultimately is up to the incident commander and depending on the situation.
Well, hopefully they'll be able to help pick up those people or those pets from those homes. But I did have one other question that I wrote down is, we have sheriff people in town, drive all around town. I don't see many of them. On your maps, you show that there's going to be people there directing traffic and whatnot. Where are they going to come from? If there's a fire in the area, wouldn't they be at other towns? Because we share the sheriff's department with a group. Would we have enough personnel that can be here to help Portola Valley? When we had that the mock evacuation back in September, October, that a couple of town people put together, we had some problems on that corner of West Ridge and Alpine Road. Me trying to make the left-hand turn, and took a few minutes. It would have been nice to have somebody there, but it was a mock evaluation. It was a evacuation. And so I wonder, how are we going to get personnel? And I like Vic's idea of volunteers. Thank you. That's my last point.
Thanks.
I think from the DM conversations that, and I think Bob also assumed that we get about 30 minutes before we have all of the sheriff's people in place, and they would be coming from other areas in the county.
That is correct. It's obviously going to be unique to each evacuation, but if you had a townwide evacuation, that scale of an evacuation, I think I could say it's almost certain you would be getting many of the officers who would be doing traffic control from other areas would be coming in.
Okay, next is Valerie Baldwin. Valerie, can you hear me? You can unmute and ask your question.
Yes, it's a follow-up to the things Rita was talking about. I'm wondering how dynamic this plan is. I'm thinking about the fire plans in the past that end up standing unchanged for years and years and years. We've got all this development for the housing elements plan to go down Alpine Road, and these numbers would change dramatically, with hundreds more cars trying to evacuate onto Alpine Road. That's one question. The other one I was concerned about, if you've looked into the risks of the 280 freeway jamming up with cars going on from Sandhill and Alpine Road, if that would slow everything down. Thank you.
I probably would defer to Jeremy or Dale on the question of how dynamic is the plan. What I would say is I do know that the Department of Emergency Management at the county level is putting a significant amount of resources into evacuation planning. They acquired the Zone Haven platform, which provides for the tools to get the evacuation notices out and to provide recommendations on evacuation routes. And this is a tool that is available to the first responders when a fire is identified, a fire location is identified and called in and verified. They're able to plug that into the model, the platform, and it does a predicted fire spread, and very quickly within minutes is able to say, based on topography and vegetation and weather and other factors, what direction is the fire likely to go and what zones are affected, and then it issues either a warning or an evacuation notice gets issued for those. So the systems that are in place now compared to maybe say even 3 or 5 years ago are, and each of those zones, there's information about how many households, how many people, how many estimated vehicles that are parked in those zones. So that's information that is available to the incident command and the group. So I'd say the information that's available now is significantly better than what we had even 3 or 5 years ago. And they continue to work on enhancing that, and built within those modules is the information on traffic control locations. So once they identify a zone for evacuation, they know likely routes, they know where potential traffic control locations are, and that can all be communicated to the personnel in the field very quickly. So that's all information that we've taken advantage of the latest and greatest technology to have those kind of systems in place. So in terms of the dynamic nature, that what this plan is really doing is saying, what can the community do? What can the town do to go beyond that, to make some very specific arrangements for a whole host of different scenarios? Lastly, I would say that I know that DEM actually has been doing sort of evacuation, I'm blanking out on the word, but evacuation scenarios where they've actually done drills. That's what I was thinking of, where they've done evacuation drills as recently as in the last few weeks, where they've done drills and specifically looking at what happens if you have a fire at this location. How do you respond to it? So there's a lot of resources that have been, I know that DEM and sheriffs and fire were all involved in that drill that I think happened, if not last week, the week before last, at looking at potential fire in Portola Valley. So anyway, I'll stop there and see if Jeremy or Dale, if you have anything you want to add, or Rob.
I don't have any specific answer to that, except that, you know, we had to pick some fixed point to do the analysis, and, you know, as we move forward in the additional phases, including putting the school evacuations in, then we can add additional residents and cars to the plan as we move forward. But this is as the information that we have as of today. Okay, moving on, unless Jeremy or Rob, you have any other comments?
The only thing I would add is I think that the work done at the dam by the sheriff, the fire, the dam, the town, the schools, Sequoias, I think that's really important that we keep that moving on and that we get at least some initial plans out of that this year.
I agree. Thanks, Rob.
What about 280?
We did take into account traffic volumes on 280 and evacuation. So it is built into the model that we used, is the volumes that would be in place at the time of the event. And that was based on real traffic volumes from I-280 in terms of traffic that is actually occurring. And what we assumed was anybody exiting 280 at sort of the affected interchanges at Sand Hill and Alpine would be directed to go essentially down the hill into Palo Alto. They would not be allowed to turn and go up into Portola Valley. So That is built into the model that we analyzed, and it influences the evacuation times.
Okay, thank you. Patty, I think it's dues.
Hi, I'm just gonna, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just gonna take a few seconds because I don't have any original thought today. I'm just gonna pile on. I loved Vic's idea about the volunteers, primarily because I think it's a pipe dream to believe we're gonna have 21, and I counted them, emergency help to staff all of those intersections, particularly if it's a widespread evacuation. I just don't believe, there's just not enough people to go around. So I think we need a backup plan similar to what Vic proposed. And also, I also want to pile on to the people who are talking about people coming back into town. It's going to happen. We have to plan for it. Thanks. That's all. Bye.
Thank you, Patty. Next, Christy Corley.
Yes, thank you. I am, let me get organized here. I think we could very likely have a surprise incident. The CZU fire was 7 miles away, and a fire travels 7 miles quite quickly. I do have friends in the Santa Rosa fire, and I want to share their scenario. They lost their house. Santa Rosa they went to bed at 10 or 11. The glow came over the hill behind them. They went to all the neighbors and woke them up. The wife went to the safe, loaded 2 cars. The 3rd car was left on the driveway, and that car survived. I just wanted to share that with you. And I'm concerned about Upper Alpine from the Portola sign to say Corte Madera. What is happening in there? We know there was a 2017 traffic report which is county area, and it addressed La Cuesta and La Mesa. So you're still working with those 2 areas. I think we're Portola Valley. We want to not be on a possibly a 1-lane road. So what's happening at Los Trancos Alpine? What would happen at Portola Alpine, Hillbrook Alpine, Golden Oak Alpine? We know from the Paradise fire, so the arterials above Westridge are of concern as well. The Paradise fire, we had a manager come and talk to town council, and one of their road concerns was there was swales that went down on both sides, and a swale does not allow for a large fire truck to park on. Therefore, they could not do that effectively. So how can we take care of our swales that go slightly down, in a lot of cases, say a trail? I think that needs to be thought about, and they need a wide enough area to park their trucks to use the water. So Upper Alpine is a concern, and that is where I live. Let's see. I also am concerned about the construction that is coming up. I listed 10 things, and we already have approved fire station, Willows Commons. We're looking at the Wedge, Glen Oaks, Ladera Church, Ford Field, Nathorst Triangle, lot next to Roberts, and so on. So that's a lot of trucks and PVSD. They are in construction right now. So what will we tell these construction sites and their trucks, which could also become a problem for us getting out? I'm concerned about the 1.91 per household. Some of the units going in are 3 and 4 bedroom. I know we have 3 cars, we're a family of 4. So that's of concern as well. Is that true, that 1.91, or do most houses have, 2 to 3 cars and 4 people living in? We don't know. There's 250 people in the ranch. I don't know, I'm guessing on Sequoia's 300. How many students? I think we need to add these all up. Alpine Inn, there's 120 cars parked there at most times. How are we going to deal with Alpine Inn at Rastadero and Alpine? I think those are my main concerns, and I thank you for your report and taking our considerations. I also am concerned about 280 down through to Stanford and Menlo Park is a parking lot right now because they're doing construction. So they've eliminated, it goes from 1 lane to 2 lanes, back to 1 lane, back to 2 lanes. That area needs to be looked at because that's employees. If we do get the wedge here, they will be going down that way and coming back. So we have to hook the whole Alpine Road together and solve the whole road together, not just pieces. And that's my comments. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Christy. Just a couple quick notes on the segment of Alpine. You mentioned through Ladera, La Cuesta, and La Mesa. That was I think the traffic report you're referencing recommended roundabouts. That's one of the things that we noted was sort of potential issues with a roundabout at those locations if that were to be installed. But those intersections are in the county, so that would be a decision that would be made by the county outside of the town's purview. But I'm sure there'll be collaboration about that segment of Alpine going forward. In terms of from Westridge back to Portola, those are all stop control intersections and would I think ideally in a townwide evacuation have traffic control those locations to facilitate the movements, particularly from all those side streets that you mentioned, turning on to Alpine, evacuating. The 1.9 vehicles per household is an average. We looked at all the demographic data that we were able to acquire in terms of the households in Portola Valley and the surrounding area, how many people per household, the age of those people, the number of those who are likely to be drivers, the number of vehicles per household, all the information we could get a hold of from the census, and that derived the number of 1.9. That's actually on the high end of what we've seen from other, for instance, the Santa Rosa fire was 1.75, and the studies that UC Berkeley did of the fires in 2017 through 2019 were about 1.89. So we're actually at the higher end, and that doesn't surprise me that we are.
Do you look at the 2021 census data?
No, you're referring to the new 2020 census data?
Yeah.
Much of that has not been released yet. It will be released in the next year or two. So we still don't have access to that. So what we have access to is, at least at that level of detail, is the prior census data.
But we also have the Zone Haven data, which was also used.
That is correct. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
I think that's all that I had with respect to Alpine and the vehicles per household.
What about the swales on either side and the width of the rest of the road on Alpine?
I'm not sure that I have any. I'm just not familiar with what you're talking about. I'm sorry.
So the trails drop down.
Yes.
So the next to the road, often the trail is down. So if a vehicle needed to park there, they can't.
Yeah, I think the segment that we're talking about between Westridge and 280 doesn't have that same characteristic that I think you're talking about. That's between Westridge and Portola.
Well, the trail on the right side of the road towards Alpine Inn, Alpine Swim and Tennis, and you didn't address Alpine Inn.
Yeah, so is the concern that vehicles would not be able to park on the shoulder if there was an evacuation?
Yes, or a fire truck. I'm taking the advice from the manager of Paradise, where she said anytime you can make sure that there's room for a vehicle on the right and left that's flat.
Right. I mean, I think we recommended adding the additional evacuation shoulder, providing an evacuation shoulder lane between West Ridge and 280, because that's where we saw the highest volume, the highest demand. And also where I think we saw it was more feasible to widen than as you get further closer to Portola, where you have the issues that you just mentioned, where you have it would be more difficult, let's say, to widen to provide a shoulder in that area where you've got the swales.
Okay, I think we need to look at that as well. I participated in the mock evacuation, and we did get log jammed from Westridge on, but there was only 200 people in that evacuation. So we would expect way more, yeah.
And Christy, to your comment about the arterials, those were not evaluated in this study. That's, we'll work on that in the next study.
Okay, and I think at Arastadero, the Alpine Inn, where 120 cars, how are they going to get out?
That also, remember this evacuation study was done at 6 o'clock in the morning. That wasn't part of this study. That has to be the next phase.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
I understand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, MJ Lee.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say Dale and Rob and Bob Grandy, I think this report is really excellent, and thank you. I know it took a long time, but you guys have put so much work and thought into it. It's really great. So I just have a kind of a stupid question. Bob, you said that widening Alpine could reduce the evacuation times by maybe almost half. And then your estimates for the south only routes, ranged from 7 to 60 minutes. So what I was wondering is there a desired target time for evacuating? For example, if we widen the roads and reduce the evacuation to 30 minutes, is 30 minutes a good number? Is that sufficient? I mean, how do you evaluate that?
The short answer is there is no industry standard currently in terms of a desired evacuation time. Anywhere that I know, either on a national or a state level, and I've not seen anybody adopt one. So I think the short answer is no. Nobody's sort of made that jump in terms of saying here's a ideal or evacuation time, if you will. And when I was referring to the 50% reduction, it wasn't necessarily in terms of the average travel times, although that's a good question. I was thinking more in terms of the amount of time to evacuate, say 90 or 100% of the population. I think that could be substantially maybe reduced by as much as 50%, although we haven't run the numbers. But given that we're potentially upwards of doubling the outbound capacity, I mean, I know you're not going to get twice with a shoulder, you're not going to get twice the capacity bump that you would with a normal travel lane. But you're going to get some significant increase in capacity. So, but no, the answer to your question, there's not a desired evacuation time that's any kind of industry standard.
Is that it, MJ? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Next, Ronnie Krasinski.
Hi,
my question was actually pretty similar. I guess you're saying there's no standard, but is there any way to assess, are these evacuation times considered good or bad, or perhaps comparisons to other communities?
I would say the short answer again is no. I mean, what we've been using the evacuation, first of all, there aren't many communities who've gone through this process. It's certainly not in Northern California. And each one of the scenarios is unique that they're dealing with. Some communities are, not many are looking at a full evacuation of all residents. So sort of what we've seen in other areas that they said, what if you had a fire in this area and you evacuated this group of zones over here in this portion of the county versus this portion of the county over here. So each one tends to be unique in terms of the evacuation time estimates that we're seeing prepared. So it's hard to do an apples to apples comparison of any kind of evacuation times, because the number of residents and employees being evacuated, the routes that are available, they're all different. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have by chance the evacuation times from the Ashland study handy?
My recollection, and this is just an off the top of my head recollection, is that it was in the 3 to 4 hour window, but a larger community, more people evacuating in the case of Ashland. But that's my recollection. Okay. And they ran a number of different scenarios too, so it's hard to give sort of one number, but my recollection it was in that 3 to 4 hour range, and I think that was the 90% evacuated within 3 to 4 hours for the range of scenarios they looked at.
Great. Next, Allison.
Hi. I am following on to what MJ and Ron said. It looks like we all have the same thing on our mind. I'm understanding that there is no industry standard for what is considered a reasonable evacuation time. I mean, I kind of looked at the worst case scenario here, scenario 2, where it looked like 90 minutes was the maximum time it would take for someone moving out of town in a constrained situation at peak hour. But I think before this is presented to the community at large, people are going to want to know, well, is this a good outcome? Are we in good shape? Understanding too that it's a baseline study before we've added any more population to the town. But is 90 minutes or 60 minutes, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And even if there isn't an industry standard, is there something that you can give us as a consultant to say, hey, you guys are in good shape, or, warning, warning? I think that's something we need to know coming from somewhere.
I'm afraid that, I mean, what we can do is help develop strategies, work with the first responders to develop strategies and ways to address evacuation. I think I don't know that we can make any kind of statement about whether the evacuation times are good or bad, because there's no basis for us to do that. That I think that's a decision that each individual will have to make in terms of the information that we present. I know that's not the answer that you would like.
Is it something maybe that the Woodside Fire Protection District can comment on? Or, it's not necessarily a fire that we would be evacuating, that would be the reason for evacuation, but for any other disaster, perhaps from those bodies, they can tell us, is this enough time? Is it too much time? Are we good? Are we bad? That's my comment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
we can bring it up to the DEM and Woodside Fire and see if they have any comments. I'm not sure we will get anything, Allison, but that's a good comment for everybody. I think the big thing, remember, is it is personal safety, and the old adage is evacuate early and often. Okay, do we have anything else from the community before I move on to final questions from the committee? Okay, I'm going to close public comment. Thank you all. You had some very good comments. I'm sure Bob will take them under consideration as we move forward. Mary Ann, I see your hand up.
Yeah, what I would like to understand, so we have an evacuation order at 6 in the morning. Supposedly, a high percentage of residents are in bed and have their cell phone muted. How can 85% of these residents be on the road at 7:45? How did they know?
I would say that the quick answer is we don't know that, but that we, the desire was to prepare an analysis that stressed the network to see what would happen if 85% of the residents were on the road in that time period and how long it would take to evacuate under that scenario. So it's a scenario that we're evaluating. We're not providing any kind of guarantee that this is exactly the way it's going to happen, but that was the desire was to have a stress test and we feel like that's a fairly aggressive stress test of the network based on what others have done in other communities. As I showed you, it's considerably more aggressive than what Ashland assumed in their analysis. So I think it may not happen. If it doesn't happen, the evacuation time would be different. If you have people evacuating over starting their trip over a longer period of time.
I understand that. Actually, Bob, that's unfair. That was not a question to you because that's not a traffic question.
Okay.
It is a general question. We need to be very clear how the residents are going to know that there is an order. That's what I'm saying. And this is a huge assumption. And let's not forget about that.
No, and I think that's a very good reason to sort of have these communication strategies, what we call information side strategies or communication strategies, because part of this overall system is getting the message out to residents as early and quickly as possible. And I think there need to be different tools for getting that information out to residents. And I think there's been some discussion about warning sirens, which can be challenging in the community given the hilly configuration and what that means. But I guess that is sort of a question and probably an ongoing question for the community to think about, and whether or not that is something that would be desirable maybe in some of the remote areas or in some of the areas where egress is challenged, if you will. But all of those kinds of different communications tools are important to develop and to have for the community.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Craig, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Dale. So yeah, this is a great report and a lot of good information. So, thank you all for working so hard on it. I was curious how we think the stress test is representative of, say, an afternoon fire. Because I think one of the things we heard in the public comment was kind of conflating people are trying to come back in because they're at work, whereas you basically just had this as a stress test study at 6 a.m. So kind of one way at 6 a.m. makes a lot of sense because everybody's kind of here that's going to be here and you're just trying to get everybody out. How does the sort of two-way traffic flow where it is afternoon and people need to get back to their houses to evacuate. I mean, is there some way to sort of compare those two, the kind of one-way scenario that the stress test is showing versus a two-way that, you know, if we had, you know, some fire got started, arson, whatever, but it, you know, didn't start at night, but actually started sometime during the day. I mean, how do we kind of compare these, or is there another study in here or another step? And I'm just trying to understand the differences.
Yeah, I think it could be tested. I think you'd have to get some consensus on how the actual scenario would play out. Is it a townwide evacuation? That would be sort of the first question. To the extent it's a townwide evacuation, again, you would have the issue of, I think, your of whether or not folks would be allowed to return back if essentially the fire was so bad and moving so quickly that there was a townwide evacuation. The question would be, would folks be allowed to return, and how would that be managed under that kind of situation? So I think you'd have to figure those things out in order to run a reasonable scenario. But I think in that case, you'd have certain households that would be able to evacuate as soon as the order was made, and other households that may wait until the resident who's employed and working off-site is able to return home to help them evacuate, or to evacuate with them. So I think you'd probably have, my sense is, and this is how Ashland treated it, you'd have more of a stretched out or staggered departure curve, where the departure would happen over a slower period of time. You would have less residents evacuating in that first hour because of that kind of scenario. Because we then have to take a look at how many employed residents are there in town versus retired residents, et cetera, and figure out sort of that whole dynamic. It could be done, but we'd have to build a scenario to test. But I think my initial reaction would be you'd probably have a slower departure curve that would be part of a daytime evacuation, which means you'd have an elongated evacuation as people stretch out over a longer period of time.
Right, and presumably the incident commander would probably keep two-way traffic. I mean, they may limit who they let in, but they might limit it to, they might let two-way traffic continue until the outbound pressure got high enough that they needed to turn it back into a one-way system.
Yeah, I would be, I'm not sure I could comment on that. I think that would be something that we would want to ask the folks at Woodside Fire and the sheriffs about how they might handle that. But as I said, each situation is probably unique, and I'm not sure we get a single answer as to at what point they would cut off the ability to get into town.
Sure, yeah, and like you say, I mean, every actual situation is going to be quite different, because a complete townwide evacuation is a pretty major event versus we need to get this portion of town evacuated. So yeah, there's a lot of different situations. I guess my only comment would be when you do this deck, particularly for the public, I still think you need to make sure that you put all this stuff in context, because I think for you, it's very clear. We did a study, which is a stress test, and you have a very, I'll call it narrow, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but a narrow view of we've done the stress test, and that's exactly kind of what we've asked you to do. But I think it's important that the context be around this, that there are a lot of other situations, that this is just one of them, you know, so that people don't get confused as is the stress test is the only evacuation method, and everybody then freaks out because it's like, well, this can't possibly work. Well, it's one of many different possible evacuations, actual situations. So I think if you can just slide, maybe some examples saying, you know, ways it we did this stress test in detail and then go into the details might help people contextualize it a little bit better. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
Dale, I have to leave for a medical appointment.
So Dale, you're muted.
Thank you, Craig.
No problem.
We're way past our normal meeting time here. Do we have any other committee members wishing to speak or have questions or comments? Okay, Christy Corley, I'm going to let you go ahead and speak here real quick, and then we're going to close the meeting.
Thank you. I know we can get vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and the units are averaging 6 trips a day. So if I look at average of 1.9 cars per unit, that would be 3,600 cars. And if you go to the max for 4 cars per unit, you would have to exit 7,200 cars. Am I right by thinking that? And then I kind of liked your idea of warning sirens, because we're only 9 mile by 9 mile community. So a siren in the middle might capture everyone. I just wanted to share that thought. And I also like a noon evacuation rather than a 6 a.m. evacuation. Thank you.
Couple of quick comments, Christy. I think we set up front, we chose the 6 a.m. because it was hopefully a maximum stress on the system so we could know what the roads would bear. Also, a midday evacuation raises a whole number of other issues, particularly with the schools, the sequoias and so on, trying to ascertain how their evacuation plans fit with everything else. And it was just too complicated to try and get our hands around. That is the next step, as with the trying to judge the arterials. And another comment is we looked extensively at sirens twice now in the fire district. The fire district looked at it about 8 or 10 years ago, and the wildfire committee, my subgroup at that time, looked at it about 3 years ago. The challenge with Portola Valley, with all its canyons and topography, would require a significant number of sirens to be located in town. And there's a second issue of siting those sirens, because land is very expensive. They all would have to be independent with their own power supply and so on. And so it was just deemed really, really expensive to try and cover the community, particularly the areas you'd be most worried about, which are the distant areas of the town. Now, the town could certainly revisit it, as could the fire district, but at this point, it's a very expensive, time-consuming issue. Thank you, Christy. Okay, any other final comments from anyone? Great. Well, we thank you all very much for your inputs, for your comments. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more from Bob as we move forward. And with that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.